Hello, everyone, and good morning. Welcome to today's HR Advice webinar, which is Employee Relations in Outspoken Times, Managing Belief and Freedom of Expression at Work. But as you can see, I'm joined by some very special guests today from AdviserPlus. Today, we've got HR Technical Consultant Sarah Kerr and Senior HR Advisor Sarah Triggs to share their expertise on the topics that we talk about today. But yeah, now that we've met the speakers, I'm just going to quickly go over the contents of today's session. There's loads of really good stuff that we're going to be talking about. So first of all, what is a belief? So we're going to be talking about religious versus philosophical, freedom of expression versus workplace impact. We've also got some real tribunal cases and outcomes to talk about. Social media, obviously a huge thing nowadays, so talking about that and employee conduct. Managing difficult conversations, and then we also have some kind of suggested policies, training ideas and practical solutions to everything that we're speaking about today. So yeah, loads to get started with, and yeah, we may as well just get going then. So first of all, what is a belief? So we all kind of have an understanding of what a belief is, but what does it mean to us from an employment law perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Alice. So in UK law, some of you may know, a religious or philosophical belief is a specifically protected characteristic under Section 10 of the Equality Act 2010. And what this essentially means is that employees can't be treated less favourably by their employer because they hold a certain philosophical or religious belief, where they genuinely hold those beliefs and where they generally express them in an appropriate manner. So if I just break that down a little bit more. So for religious beliefs, the Equality Act provides a slightly longer list than I'll state now, but in short, for the purposes of delivery, a religious belief must stem from a recognised faith, a smaller religious movement or a distinct denomination or a sect, and the religious beliefs need to have a clear structure and a clear faith. You can actually read the full description of what a religious belief covers, I believe, in a glossary that we're also providing for you today. So then just moving on to a philosophical belief, with regards to philosophical beliefs, to qualify in law as a philosophical belief, that belief must meet a set of 5 criteria, which we now call the Granger criteria. And the Granger criteria is used because there was a case which was won by an employee called Mr. Nicholson, and he made a claim against his former employer, Granger PLC, back in 2010. And what happened here was Mr. Nicholson held a really deep belief and a really strong personal conviction regarding climate change. And what he believed was that humanity was under threat, and therefore mankind had a moral duty, like a strong moral duty, to cut carbon emissions to basically prevent catastrophic climate change. So Mr. Nicholson essentially lived his entire life around his beliefs in climate change. So, for example, throughout the way in which he travelled, so he wouldn't necessarily take aircraft, he'd go by train, the way he shopped, and also even the way he reduced as much waste as possible in his entire life. And what happened here is that his employer Granger PLC made Mr. Nicholson redundant, and then Mr. Nicholson then claimed discrimination, and he argued that he was mainly selected for redundancy because of his strong advocacy of climate change views. Now, he also had a role which was, I think, head of sustainability, which, goes hand in hand, I suppose, with his personal life. But in this case, interestingly, Mr. Granger was actually able to show that to the courts, when they asked how his climate change beliefs governed all aspects of his daily routines, he was able to actually show them that he lived by the rules of reducing waste, energy, and also travel emissions to their lowest possible points through his actions. And that's really key here. So the court here concluded that Mr. Nicholson did in fact hold a genuine philosophical belief, and as a result of this particular case, they were then able to put in place a detailed set of 5 criteria that must be met for a belief to qualify for protection under the Equality Act. So this is now quite useful because it's referred to as a test, and it gives us 5 points for employers to be aware of. And these include, and I'll just read through them. Again, you'll probably be able to refer to this in the glossary. So number 1, the belief, it must be genuinely held by the person. Number 2, it must be more than just an opinion, or sorry, it must be more than just an opinion, I should say. It must concern a weighty and substantial aspect of human life and behaviour. 4, it must have a certain level of cogency, significance, cohesiveness and importance. And 5, it must be credible of respect in a democratic society. So thinking about all of those, now if an employee is penalised by their employer for evoking their right to express either a philosophical or religious belief, then the tribunals will not only look at this test, the Granger test that I've just mentioned here, but what they'll also look at is applying a second test to decide whether the employer's actions were justified and within the law. And this second test, which we'll get onto in more detail later, is called the proportionality test.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Yeah, so by the sounds of it, loads of different things could be protected as a belief in the workplace, but at the same time, like, we might have to take a common sense approach as to what is a belief or not, I suppose. So let's actually run a poll next. So I do just have a poll for everyone, just to ask the question, which of these do you think is a protected belief? So let me launch that on your screen now. And I'll give you about a minute or so just to answer that. So out of those 4 options there, which of these are a protected belief? Is it gender critical beliefs, voodooism, veganism, or pro-Brexit beliefs? Great, and I will just end that and share the results then. So thank you everyone for those responses. Sarah, what do you think of these?
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting categories on that poll, and I think it's fair to say from our perspective on a day-to-day basis, it's a tricky question for us as well. But I think since the Granger case that Sarah had mentioned just before with the poll, there's been lots of subsequent cases that have then gone through the tribunals across the country where that test has now been applied, and against lots of things that claimants should feel, or they feel should be a protected belief. So couple of answers here. So in the years since Granger, the tribunal have held that voodooism is a protected belief and that veganism is too. On the flip side, vegetarianism isn't deemed to be a protected belief, which I always find quite an interesting choice. I know I saw some of you selected pro-Brexit beliefs as we cast our eyes back to all those years ago when we were dealing with Brexit, but that is not a protected belief. But it is worth noting that the tribunal have given protection to obviously things like climate change, like in the Granger case, fox hunting and spiritualism over the years. So I think what that shows is that there's already quite a lot of different things there when each and every one of us has a totally set of different beliefs for lots of different reasons. So I think one thing that really came to mind when I saw that poll and everyone's numbers changing is that quite a few of our participants today have selected gender critical beliefs here too, which isn't surprising because I'm sure we're all aware there's been a lot of stuff in the news about that following the Supreme Court ruling that we had last year on the definition of biological sex, and also the really highly publicised Sandy Peggy case, where there was a nurse who complained about a transgender doctor using a female changing room on that front. And we're going to cover some more case law a little later on gender critical beliefs in more detail on that front. I think what it's fair to say is that this is a really difficult area for employers, employees, and the wider public to consider, because beliefs in that area and lots of different areas are going to differ from individual to individual. And I think it would probably be fair to say that a lot of us have been involved in discussions around that issue when it's been in the headlines, and that's either in the office, around the kitchen table, or even just down the pub with your friends on that front. Just to give you all a bit of context about what these cases actually look like across the country. There was some research not that long ago that has shown that employment tribunal cases involving protected beliefs have risen 380% over the past 5 years. Now that's climbed from 6 cases in 2021 to 29 in 2025. Now, within these cases, it was views relating to religion that were the most common claims, and that accounted for about 31% of those cases, while cases relating to gender critical views and transgender rights accounted for 24%. Now, when we look at that number of 25 in 2025, that might not seem like a lot, but I think what we have to remember is that lots and lots of cases are commenced in the employment tribunal, but never reach a full tribunal hearing for lots of different reasons. And I think what these statistics show is that people are becoming a lot more aware of what their rights are and what protections should be given to them because of the beliefs that they hold. Now, I'm not a fortune teller, but what we are seeing is that there is a rise in people using things like AI, ChatGPT, to support them with processes like grievances, disciplinaries, legal claims, things like that, which is opening up the scope of their understanding of their rights as well. So I'm going to take a really good guess that we are going to see those numbers that are on your screen at the moment rise exponentially in the years to come.
100%, yeah. Thank you, Sarah. So yeah, as we've seen, loads of different types of beliefs might be protected then, but what about in practice? So if someone feels that their beliefs haven't been respected in the workplace, or that felt they've been treated differently because of these, what impact could that have on their employer?
Yeah, that's a good question, Alex. Thanks for that. So essentially, if an individual's belief haven't been respected in the workplace, then I mean that could either be by colleagues, managers, because of the business's ways of working. This can obviously open the floodgates up for complaints against the business, and if the complaints are received, then it can also have a knock-on effect on things like team dynamics, retention, productivity rates, and also essentially the business's reputation, which I think is quite an important one for a lot of employers. So if an individual feels that they've been treated differently in the workplace because of their belief, like in the Granger case that I mentioned earlier, then they may make a claim of direct discrimination to the employment tribunals. And I think it's worth mentioning that in addition to that, if the employer has a policy or a procedure in place that detrimentally impacts how employees can talk about or display their beliefs in the workplace, then employers might also put themselves at a risk of a claim of indirect discrimination. So I think if we look at case law, a good example here is going to be that of Miss Awida versus British Airways, which I hope some of you will know. You may not all know about this, but it was some time ago. In this case, what essentially happened was British Airways had a uniform policy which banned visible jewellery for religious symbols, unless they were specifically classed, I think, as being what they term a mandatory scriptural requirement. And in this case, Miss Awida was suspended from work for refusing to actually just conceal her Christian cross under a uniform. So she wanted to have it on show just outside of a collar when basically at work. And then what happened was she put a claim in to the employment tribunals and was actually successful in her claim eventually against British Airways that the policy they had in place was in fact discriminatory, as it didn't allow her to, and her right, I suppose, to wear her religious necklace and therefore it was deemed that it was a judgment against her religious belief, or an issue against her religious belief. So what this shows is, if an individual is successful in a discrimination claim like Miss Awida was, their potential compensation can also be uncapped. And it's important that employers really are proactive in preventing these type of situations from occurring, which is always possible, especially where they can reduce the risks of possible claims occurring and quite large payouts. And I think what excuse me, cases like this really show is that not only do employers need to protect individuals who've got beliefs in the workplace from being infringed, but they also have a need to protect others from being subject to views which could be abusive to them. Things like making harassing statements or things like that. But I think the overarching message here, hopefully, is that a balanced approach really needs to be taken. It's the manner in which a view is expressed and how, or whether it upsets other employees, is where an employer might need to take some form of disciplinary action. So I think, as mentioned earlier, that there was another important test to be aware of. I said I would touch on it later. And this test has come about through the courts again, as you might imagine, and their management of previous cases. So what that tends to do is always shape current case law. And this test has brought about a 4-stage point, if you like. It's called the 4-stage test, essentially, and it's used to determine if a decision or action by an employer, such as a policy change or taking disciplinary action against someone, can be justified as what we call proportionate, or what we know as proportionate. And what I'll do now is just talk you through these 4 points on this second test, stage by stage, one by one. And what you'll find is this test sets out some questions for employers to consider. Again, I think you might have this in your glossary, but you'll certainly have this to reference after the seminar or webinar today. So number 1, it asks, is there a legitimate objective? So in essence, this is asking employers, does the restriction put in place by you, the employer, serve as a genuinely sufficient important goal? Secondly, it asks, is there a restriction, is there a rational connection between what you're trying to do? So this is asking, is the measure taken by the employer, is it logically connected to achieving the objective that the employer wants to achieve or wished to achieve, whichever way you want to look at it? Thirdly, it asks about the necessity. So this means, for example, could the same goal the employer's seeking have been achieved through an alternative action? For example, a policy change or a policy clarification or an amendment to a policy is a good example, because I've just used it. Fourthly, it looks at asking, did the employer apply a fair and balanced kind of did they take a fair and balanced approach, and did they act proportionately? So this asks, did the employer weigh the severity of the impact on the individual's freedoms against the benefit to themselves, so that the employer themselves or the public interest? In short, I think what I'm saying here is, does the balance favour the restriction, if that makes it easier to understand? So for context, if we think about BA's case, which I just talked about, did BA weigh up their original policy and how it could impact their employees' rights to enact or express their religious belief fully? Well, I think I've just shown you, no, they didn't. It was not found to be proportionate. And so they had to change and implement a new policy which did allow religious display of things that, jewelry and other things that showed someone's religious belief. So I think it's always really important and worth employers keeping these two tests in mind and essentially using them to kind of risk assess any action that they might want to either take against an employee for the way they've expressed a belief in the workplace, or certainly if you're planning something like a new policy that you want to that you want to implement, that you think might impact someone's beliefs negatively.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Yeah, really interesting points there as well, especially the case. And it's really interesting that you mentioned impact there as well. So what impact does the law have on a day-to-day life of employees? What can they say in the workplace? And like, what rights do they have to make complaints and if they don't agree with what someone else says, for example?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question there, Alice. And I think what the cases that we've mentioned today so far show is that employees don't leave their rights at the workplace door, and that their beliefs form part of who they are, and that freedom of thought, their conscience, religion and expression, that might be relevant both at work and in their personal lives. Now, I'm sure that a lot of our attendees today are always really keen to encourage their employees to bring their full and true selves to work. And that's because when people feel comfortable in themselves at work, we can help to ensure their well-being and their happiness is promoted. And there's been lots of research over the years as well, which shows that if you've got that, that will ultimately feed into their productivity and good levels of retention in staff as well. So it's a win-win situation. However, I think what it shows is that the rights that these individuals have are not unlimited. And we do have to do that balancing act that Sarah mentioned, and we have to protect others where their beliefs might infringe on others in that situation. Now, I remember quite a few years ago when we were working on our advice lines and following the murder of George Floyd and the rise in the Black Lives Matter movement, we saw a real surge of cases on the advice lines where employees had counteracted that by making statements such as "White Lives Matter." And those kind of situations, they do leave both employees and employers in a really difficult situation, because both of those individuals might hold genuine beliefs, but they might be seen as inappropriate, discriminatory, or objectionable to others on that front. The other thing that we've got to bear in mind is how these comments come about. Now, these kind of issues, they might arise from comments made in meetings, debates, either in person, or things like internal forums, like things like Beaver Engage or Yammer, if you use any of those engagement platforms. They can also occur in things like customer-facing conversations, or just a conversation in a breakout area, kitchen, lunchroom, where team members are grabbing a coffee and having a chat. I think the really big thing there to remember is that managers, supervisors, leaders, you can't be watching or controlling what those employees say every minute, every day. So it can be really hard to predict when and how those issues might arise. So, as regular attendees at our webinars will probably guess, one of our hints and tips in this session is that prevention and education are the key to making sure that employees are having safe and sensible conversations in the workplace. As a starting point, we'd always recommend that you had a really good suite of policies in place covering things like harassment, dignity at work, equal opportunities, and within those policies setting out what the consequences might be if employees act in breach of those requirements. Now, you might also want to consider some wider policies as well, such as a gender identity policy, which sets out how we would support and protect an individual during a transition, for example. And within that process, you should also make sure that there are really clear ways and means for people to report behaviour that they feel has infringed their beliefs or is offensive to them. Now, you could do that either via your grievance process and your whistleblowing policies as well. But you can also do things like providing anonymous channels via your intranet if you have one, if people don't feel comfortable coming forward to their manager or someone directly if something has upset them. The other thing that we'd always recommend as a prevention element in this area is training on that front. And training in this area is really crucial to preventing these types of disputes from occurring. And that's both for employees and for managers as well. Now, that training could take different formats. It could be via digital platforms or face-to-face on that front. Either way, depending on what works for your business, any shift patterns, how people interact, is great, but to make that effective, I'd always advise that either that live session or some kind of follow-up session in a team meeting includes some examples to encourage really good quality conversations and bring the right to hold a belief to life. Now, that's something that I use in training when I'm delivering all the time, especially when we're talking about things like harassment and discrimination, and it always encourages loads of discussions. The only disclaimer I'd give on that training point is to make sure that at the start of your training session that there is a bit of a trigger warning at the start of the session, because there might be things that you talk about in that session that make people feel upset or uneasy. So it's there just as a caveat at the start to make sure that they understand that if they feel upset or uneasy about any of those topics that are being discussed, they can take a break from the session, or they can reach out to you afterwards after the session if they need some further support. And you can also make it clear at the start of any training session on these topics that it is a safe space to discuss things, but that people within that session should respect the opinions of others throughout that training and also afterwards too, so that we're carrying that message clearly through.
Definitely, thank you. Really helpful advice, Sarah. Just a reminder to all of you as well, obviously the points that Sarah's been mentioning there, all of this can be found in the handout. So if you click that icon there, you can download not only the slides, but that helpful glossary as well, obviously covering the terms and things today. But yeah, let's actually run another poll at this point, kind of moving on to the next section that we're going to be talking about. And this is kind of relating to discussions outside of work between employees. So is this something that employees can get involved in at all? And this poll, let me launch this on your screen now, is so in a WhatsApp group that you've got with some teammates, somebody makes a comment about somebody's race that you find offensive. In this situation, can your employer do anything? So do you think they can, they can't, or you're not sure? Fab, I'll just end that now. Thank you, everyone. So yeah, a little bit of a mixed bag to this. Sarah, is there a right or wrong answer?
The age-old question. Thanks, Alice. Another really good question there, but I could see by the results, yeah, I think you know, a lot of people are doing quite well out there, so that's good to see. So yeah, I think here the problem is, especially for those that don't know or have said I don't know, I think the usual problem comes up where, or for employers, is that they're asking themselves or looking at it from the point of, by not discriminating against one person on the grounds of their protected characteristic, they're asking or finding themselves, are they at risk of discriminating against another person or another group on the grounds of their protected characteristic? So a bit, you know, it's a tricky balancing act. They're always kind of doing a bit of that. That said, there are absolutely times when it is appropriate to investigate inappropriate behaviours. And as we referenced earlier, some beliefs do cross the line and are not always protected, especially where they're targeting a group or seen to be overstepping, like bordering on harassment or maybe excessive. Promoting things like hate speech, for example, would, you know, absolutely not be accepted. So I think in short, the answer is yes. In certain circumstances, employees can take action about comments made on social media by their employees when outside of work. Although, again, as I think my colleague mentioned, an employee's private life is generally their own. An employee can take disciplinary action, however, up to and including dismissal if a personal social media post, for example, outside of work, does cross a specific threshold or specific thresholds. I think what's worth noting here and worth stating is that these cases always really need evidence. Evidence is key, and evidence is what really matters, as in, most investigations. So if we look at one of the biggest cases that we've seen in case law on the use of social media historically, it's called Forstater versus the Centre for Global Development Europe, not one that rings off the tongue, or CDG, that doesn't ring or roll off the tongue either, does it, for short. So this case was actually heard some time ago, back in 2018, I think, and it concerned a lady by the name of Maya Forstater, and she was employed. She was a researcher for the company, working on a fixed term contract. And during her contract term, she made several posts on Twitter, the old school name. I know it's now called X. And what she did was she publicly expressed her views on the Gender Recognition Act, saying that biological sex was distinct from gender identity. Now, as you can imagine, at the time, that led to complaints from other staff that her views were transphobic and essentially exclusionary. And as a result, what Miss Forstater did, or I should say what the employer did, to Miss Forstater, was not renew her contract. And as a result, she then raised a successful, I can't say that word, discrimination and victimisation claim to the tribunals. And as a result, she was then awarded a huge sum, I think you'll agree, of about £91,500 plus interest. And the Employment Tribunal decided in her favour, but they did specifically feedback that her beliefs were worthy of respect in a democratic society and were widely shared in the public. Now, a second case, which you may have heard of, is also one called Higgs and Farmers School. Similarly, this one sort of is about beliefs in terms of religion and having gender critical kind of views on. It's a bit of a mix here. So in this case, Kirsty Higgs was a school administrator. She basically shared her Christian beliefs on her private Facebook page, and what she did was she didn't use her current name, she used her maiden name. She made 2 posts, and what she did was criticise a new education manifesto which was being implemented by the schools, and it was about LGBTQ plus inclusive education to teach primary school children about same-sex relationships and about transgender identities. And as you can imagine, there were complaints. There was subsequently anonymous complaints made to the school, and what the school did was ultimately decided to dismiss her. So in this case, Kirsty Higgs appealed to the tribunal, and then the tribunal held that the school had in fact acted unlawfully, and what they'd done is directly discriminated against her on the grounds of her religion and belief. They said that her Facebook posts were firstly a legitimate expression, and that the school secondly had failed to show that any actual harm had taken place, because at that juncture it hadn't, or equally that any reputational damage had occurred. And so the dismissal was, they saw it as disproportionate and unfair under the Equality Act 2010.
Yeah, they're both really interesting cases. Thanks, Sarah. And I think what those real life cases involving social media show is that although the Forstater and the Higgs cases favoured the employees, there's also a lot of case law out there as well where employers have been deemed to have done the right thing in taking action, where an employee's social media posts might not have been deemed reasonable. So I think if you are in this kind of a situation and when you're assessing whether taking action is the right thing, I'd really encourage businesses to take a really good look at what damage someone's actions might do to their business's reputation. For example, if an employee has their workplace linked to their social media profile, or they might film a video in their work uniform as well, that might be something that's more likely to cause damage to a company. Even if someone's profile on social media states that their views are their own, you should consider whether the content or the context of the posts clearly link the employee and the employer together, so that readers of those posts might reasonably think that their opinion is that of the employer too, as well. Now, we're in a world where social media is constantly evolving, and that's from things like WhatsApp and Snapchat to TikTok, and it can be really, really hard to keep up with those as well. So in addition to that training and policy points that we mentioned a little bit earlier, I think it's also really helpful for employers to have a really robust social media policy in place, along with IT usage policies as well. And that can be really useful if you've got lots of colleagues who work remotely and they might communicate both professionally and socially across lots of different platforms. Going back to Sarah's evidence points a little bit earlier, it is also really important to gather evidence to understand those potential allegations at the earliest opportunity. And that could include things like screenshots of messages that have been shared, any recordings of videos sent, and also getting witness statements from employees who might have seen a message or been part of a conversation there. And that's going to help support you in any investigations to make sure that you can gain a strong and an objective view on what's been said and why this was said, and also the wider context and implications of those. So if you're dealing with a case of potential discrimination, whether it involves either social media or other forms of communication, we'd always advise you to make sure that you're getting specific advice on your circumstances at the earliest opportunity, so that you can make sure that the right early steps are in place, so put you in the best position that you possibly can to resolve that situation in a way that helps everyone that's involved. I think ultimately as well, what we have to remember is that holding a belief, even if it's controversial, is allowed. However, it's that overriding maxim of that it must be expressed professionally and with regard to the opinions and beliefs of others, and that it can't amount to the harassment or discrimination of others, like we mentioned earlier.
Thank you, Sarah. That's given us a lot of food for thought there. Like, discussions about belief are happening all around us all the time. I'm sure about that. So yeah, loads of things for employers to look out for. But let's see if we can bring one of these situations to life a little bit. What can an employer actually do when something like this happens? So here's a scenario. So let's say an employee meets their team socially before they actually start, so before their start date, and made what some of the team perceived as misogynistic remarks. Could we withdraw the job offer at that point? You know, they've not actually started with you yet. Is that something that could happen, or what's kind of the view on this?
Yeah, that's a really tough one, Alice. So I think kind of when we look at it in that wider context, following that Louis Theroux recent documentary on the manosphere, the current climate circulating online about gender roles in society, it's a massive discussion point. And whether it's something you agree with or not, it definitely felt that earlier in the year you couldn't go on social media or have a conversation and avoid people expressing their thoughts on it. However, I think it's important to remember that these kinds of comments can massively impact how peers interact. And I've seen cases in the past where behaviour at social events, before someone starts a role, can impact not only the ability of that new hire to make the right impact in their team, but also kind of that resulting impact as well on the wider team dynamics and performance. Also, if employers let behaviour like this go unchallenged at an early stage, it can result in complaints from existing staff as well. So ultimately, these kind of comments can seriously harm workplace culture and expose a business to things like direct discrimination and harassment claims if it isn't addressed. So if we go back and look at the paper trail in a situation like this, and a lot here is going to depend on whether a contract has actually been signed. Once the contract has been signed, you can't withdraw that offer. So you then have to treat that individual as an active employee. If you are in that kind of a situation, I'd recommend that you deal with that kind of conduct via, say, a probationary process at the earliest opportunity. And as I mentioned before, I'd always recommend that you seek specific advice on that so that you know how best to frame the questions that you want to ask the individual and get the most out of that process. If you're in a situation where a contract hasn't been signed, I think even in that kind of circumstance, it's reasonable for you to carry out a short and fair investigation there, just to give the individual the opportunity to respond. And that's because when we're looking at discrimination claims, an individual can make a claim from even before they are hired, so things like in the recruitment process, and claims have been upheld during that time period as well. So there is a risk there. And I think it might be that a knee-jerk withdrawal there might put you at risk if you terminate that contracting process without just finding out a bit more about that situation. However, I think what is really clear there in that kind of situation is that action of some kind may be required to protect the wider team and also to make sure that you don't lose the trust of your existing staff as well.
Definitely, thank you. And then going back to what we were discussing, about social media as well. I've seen this a lot as well. Sadly, there is a lot of conflict going on in the world at the moment. A lot of talk about people sharing anti-Semitic views online in protest of conflict in Gaza and the Middle East and things like that. So if somebody who works for you shares this on Facebook, for example, and their profile said that they work for your company, what could you do in that scenario?
Yeah, thanks, Alice. Yeah, social media posts are a huge challenge. I think employers feel like they're blurred lines all the time between personal expression and, professional conduct in terms of what's allowed and what's appropriate. I think the key considerations here are for the employers to ascertain whether the employee's conduct has brought the employer into real disrepute, and they need to assess whether the post that's been made has really adversely affected the business or otherwise undermined the employment relationship. So I think, as my colleague said, when investigating, employers really must consider not only being fair, but almost following some simple steps, which I'll go through now, because we've sort of think that there's 8 simple steps that could be really easily applied here. So I'm going to read through them, so forgive me. Again, as I said earlier, you'll have these to refer to after the webinar. So number 1, a good piece of advice in life, I think, not only in employment law or at work: pause before reacting. So avoid knee-jerk disciplinary action in this case, especially where the issue involves a potentially protected belief. Number 2, clarify the facts. Establish exactly what was said or done, where, when, to who, by who, and in what context. Thirdly, identify the belief and the conduct separately. So really consider whether the concern that you have as an employer is the belief itself, the way it was expressed, or the impact on others. Could be all 3. But I think what you need to do is just make notes of exactly those points. Number 4, assess impact objectively. So here it means consider the evidence of actual or reasonably anticipated impact on your colleagues, your clients, service users, stakeholders, your employer's trust or reputation. Number 5, consider competing rights. Again, this is always the tricky one as well. So considering the balance, freedom of expression and the belief with any dignity at work policy you've got in place, for example, or the equality obligations and protection from harassment. Number 6, we mentioned earlier again, test proportionality. So ask here whether the proposed response that you're considering as an employer is not only suitable, but is it necessary, and no more than is reasonably required. I think the term reasonable here has equal importance. Number 7, explore informal resolution where appropriate. Obviously, this goes back to point 1, I think, the knee-jerk reaction situation, where we see a lot of employers kind of start to panic and think, oh, we've got to do something quickly. Yeah, you've got to minimise the immediate risk, but then the rest of what you do in investigation needs to be well thought out. So here, I think you could, as an employer, for example, consider a number of things. A facilitated conversation, maybe. A reminder of the standards or management guidance that may be more appropriate to take rather than formal action in the first instance, and then decide if formal action is required thereafter. Number 8, document your reasoning. Obviously, document everything during an investigation, but keep a clear audit trail showing what was considered by yourselves as the employer, what action was taken, and why the response was proportionate. Always keep those things in mind. I think also what's worth mentioning kind of lastly at this point is that during internal processes, it's equally important to maintain an awareness that a belief, even if it's offensive to others, it may be protected under the Equality Act 2010. And so you've got to, as an employer, deal with matters fairly, which is required as part of investigations, and not make those decisions based on internal or external pressure from either side of the debate, or from either side, of the reality that's going on and the noise that's perhaps going on around it.
Yeah, definitely, Sarah. And thank you for that, because I do feel that having those 8 points there to summarise kind of everything we've talked about really does help. I hope everyone watching agrees with that too. But yeah, that kind of summarises the content, I suppose, that we've gone through today, and kind of brings us to a close in terms of that. So I do just want to say thank you to Sarah and Sarah for that information that you've shared with us today. I found it really interesting. Hopefully you all did too. But following on from this, we do still have a little bit of time to go through some questions together. I've been keeping an eye on that Q&A throughout the session. There has been some really interesting questions there. So I've picked out a few that I hope that we can tackle together. And as I say, any that we don't get time to answer live, we will follow up with you afterwards and provide an answer for you. So if that's okay then, first one that I've picked out, this is, we want to protect the beliefs of our employees in the workplace, but I also need to make sure that my managers feel safe too if they need to investigate these issues. How can we do this?
Yeah, thanks, Alice. I can take this one. So I've got a bit of personal experience in this one, actually. So I dealt with a case last year where an individual raised a grievance about other individuals who had been making things like anti-Semitic and anti-Islamic comments in the workplace. So I came on board and acted as an independent grievance manager. Now, as part of that process, I had to do things like take witness statements from the individuals who had made those comments. Now, some of them, people that I spoke to, they acknowledged their comments, but others described them as banter, which is one of my most hated words in employment law. But some also didn't express any remorse for those comments as well. And on a personal level, for me, that wasn't easy, because sometimes those comments went against my own beliefs on that front. But we obviously had to then look back at those legal tests that we mentioned earlier, and what was clear was that that defensive banter on its own wasn't enough to justify that behaviour. So I think to protect myself in a position as a manager, what was really important in that process was to keep that investigation as objective as possible. So to do that, I used some reverse questioning there. For example, if you were an individual of Jewish or Islamic beliefs, how do you think those kind of comments might have made you feel? And when you're acting as an investigation manager, those kind of questions can help that individual to understand the impact of how they've expressed their views, and open doors for things like that informal resolution that Sarah mentioned in those steps just beforehand as well. I think the other thing to consider in these situations, as I said, those things went against my beliefs and that wasn't easy. So it's important that you make sure that you've got a support network for those managers who are holding those investigations. And that could be a byline to the line managers so that they feel able to talk to them, and making sure they've got access to things like employee assistance programs or mental health first aiders as well, if you've got those in your business, if they feel they've been impacted adversely. Also as well, if you need an independent individual to speak to about some of these really difficult cases, we've got our teams in our Sage HR advice lines, and they can be a really great sounding board to make sure that even if you're struggling with the content of a complaint, that you can stay objective in those circumstances.
Fab, thank you so much, Sarah. That was a really great answer. Just conscious of time there too, so I will just go through one more before we kind of wrap things up. So this next question that I've picked out, this is, it looks like it's relating to like gender neutral facilities, which I know there's been a lot of talk of in the news recently as well. So regarding that, they've said that we're not a large business, but but how do we manage this practically alongside everyone's rights to have an opinion on this in the workplace?
Yeah, that is very timely. In fact, actually, some new guidance on that came out just yesterday. So it's constantly evolving, is this area. And if we look back on that British Airways case we mentioned earlier, it's really important overall, whatever provisions you've got in place, you're not discriminating against someone's own beliefs, how they feel, how they portray themselves on that front. So I think at a practical level, if you can provide biological single-sex provisions as well as gender-neutral facilities, that is always going to be your least risky option to prevent any claims of indirect discrimination. Alternatively, if you've got an accessible facility there, you might be able to designate that as a gender-neutral option, although you'd need to clearly label that to reduce any risks on that front. If you're renting a premises or you use part of a bigger building on that front, that can make these things quite difficult. And in those situations, you might want to carry out a risk assessment to understand any impact on individuals. And I'd probably say if there are any impacts, make sure that you have kind of informal one-to-ones with individuals who might identify as transgender to understand their preferences as well and how that can be accommodated. And then lastly, if you've got any policy changes off the back of that, make sure that you consider how you communicate that to everyone. And that can be in writing, in team meetings or in huddles. And during that time of change, make sure that you've got a real open door policy in place so that if anyone feels uncomfortable about those changes, they can raise that with you at the earliest opportunity so that we can look at getting that informally resolved where possible.
100%. Thank you again for that. Yeah, so I mean, time-wise, I think that kind of brings us to the end for that. But as I say, any questions that we haven't answered, we will follow up with you after that. So kind of keep an eye for any responses coming through. Has been some interesting questions, so curious to kind of see what's said about those. But yeah, hopefully you have found it a valuable session today. Sarah and Sarah, just want to say thank you so much for your insight and guidance today. It's been a really good session. And kind of if you do want any help around any of the topics that we have covered, just some further support and things like that. So do feel free to check out these topics in the Sage HR advice portal. Or if you are one of the professional premium customers, you can actually call the advice line. So one of the consultants will happily provide any guidance on what we've covered today. And then just to let you know as well about Sage HR and Sage HR advice as well, kind of obviously the ever-changing world of HR, these will help with that. Really good kind of options there for these changes and things like that. Sorry, I'm just jumping ahead there on the slides. Sneak peek of what's to come there. Then for those of you who are watching on demand, so a recording of this webinar, just a couple of seconds on the screen there with this QR code. So if you do want to register your interest that way, you absolutely can. And then last thing from me is just going to be the upcoming webinars. Got to promote those. As I say, I do run webinars on other products too. So me and my team have Sage 50 payroll, Sage 50 accounts, etc. Always loads of things coming up with those. And then also just the next HR advice webinar as well. So that is for Wednesday, the 9th of September at 2 p.m. And that will cover the Employment Rights Act, key updates and what they mean for employers. So if you'd like to sign up for that, you've got that little link on the right-hand side of the handout there, which you can click on. Alternatively, you can always go to sage.co.uk/webinars to see all of the upcoming webinars. We've got previous recordings of sessions that we've run in the past and things too, so plenty of further support and help there. But with that being said, that does bring us to a close today. So I just want to say thank you again to everyone who's joined us. And then just, if you wouldn't mind filling out the short survey as you exit the webinar too, and we really, really appreciate any feedback that you have. And we always kind of look at that to improve the sessions going forward. But yeah, from myself, Sarah and Sarah, it's goodbye for now.